Hello everyone. Today I am back with Tagore's reading of Shakespeare, and the two plays that will be considered in this discussion are Macbeth and Chandalika. Let us move away from isms and phobias for a while. Let us not begin the discussion with ecofeminism or eco-criticism or ecophobia. Instead, let us go into a simplistic approach to Shakespeare's treatment of nature in Macbeth. In the scenes that involve the witches. In these scenes, we are in Scotland, wrapped up in the mists of a barbaric past. If we consider Macbeth's crime as a sin against nature, then Macbeth has to become unnatural to kill his sovereign and his guest, King Duncan. And the witches who provoke the murder are withered and look not like inhabitants of the earth. The witches make use of nature to defile it. They abuse men and beasts to prepare their infernal cuisine. Their ceremonies and incantations suggest the sinister charade of a black mass. The play begins in an atmosphere charged with thunder and lightning. And the entrance of the three witches, an indication of elemental turbulence, a reflection of the moral convulsions of the characters who populate the stage. Keeping in view the focus of this paper, we can now talk of Rabindranath Tagore's association with the witches of Macbeth. Tagore was only 13 when, under the tutelage of Gyan Chandra Bhattacharya, he composed a Bengali verse translation of Macbeth. It is to be noted that during this period, he also studied Kalidasa's Sakuntala. While most pieces of the verse translation were lost, the first scene was published in 1880 in Bharati magazine, and Tagore recollects in My Reminiscences, I quote, "It was Pandit Ram Sarvaswa's duty to oversee our progress in Sanskrit. He likewise gave up the fruitless task of teaching grammar to his unwilling pupil and instead read Sakuntala with me. One day, he took it to his head to show my translation of Macbeth to Pandit Vidyasagar and took me over to his house. However, later in his life, except a sonnet, Tagore wrote nothing on Shakespeare in the form of a book or article. We come across fragmentary comments of Tagore on Shakespearean drama, most of which were collected by the Bengali poet Purnendu Putri and compiled in the book Rabindranath Shakespeare. Tagore concludes that subordination of nature along with nation is a part of the process of colonization. He refers to plays like As You Like It and The Tempest, where he feels there is a major lack of incorporation of the human spirit with the forest environment. He discovers the constant endeavor to either depart from or overpower the forest. The relationship between man and wilderness is delineated either by clash or innowing or unresponsiveness or even disgust and repulsion. The peaceful cohabitation, love, and understanding between man and nature found in the great Indian text Sakuntala is, according to Tagore, replaced by colonial exploitation of nature in The Tempest. Torment, mastering, and suppression vitiate the atmosphere of The Tempest, while worship, concord, and empathy between man and nature create an ambience of serenity and harmony in Sakuntala. I would like to share in this context the views of Uma Shankar Joshi regarding Tagore's treatment of nature expressed in his essay, Tagore's Poetic Vision. I quote, "It would be a mistake to equate Tagore's love of man with European Renaissance humanism, which no doubt influenced him as just mentioned above. Western humanism is man intoxicated. It has put man at the center of the scheme of things. Tagore's humanism is not just man struggling against and conquering nature, man pitted against an unkind universe, or man entrapped in a cruel destiny. Over and over again, Tagore hints at a harmony between man and nature, man and the universal spirit. The motto he selected is Yatra Vishwam Bhavati Ekanidam, where the universe has become a single nest. The free and unfettered expression of personality, that is, selfless creativity, is the key to attaining all manhood. This is what finds utterance in his excellent allegorical play Muktadhara, The Free Current, and what made him start and run his educational experiments. Rabindranath, in a letter to C.F. Andrews, writes about his ardent kinship with nature. I quote, "From the first time that I can remember, I was passionately fond of nature. I felt even in those early days that I was surrounded with a companionship very intense and very intimate. Though I do not know how to name it, I had an exceeding love for nature that I think in what way to describe it to you. But she was a kind of loving companion, always with me and always revealing to me some fresh beauty." Elsewhere he writes, "I believe there is an ideal hovering over and permeating the earth. An ideal of that paradise which is not the mere outcome of fancy, but the ultimate reality in which all things are and towards which all things are moving. I believe that this vision of paradise is to be seen in the sunlight and the green of the earth, in the flowing streams, in the gladness of springtime, the repose of a winter morning, in the beauty of a human face, and the wealth of human love. Everywhere in this earth, the spirit of paradise is awake and sending forth its voice. It reaches our inner ears without our knowing it. It tunes our harp of life, urging us to send our aspiration beyond the finite. As flowers send their perfume into the air and the birds their songs." At this juncture, I would like to explain the concept of Prakriti and Purusha as found in the dualist Sankhya philosophy of Bhagavad Gita. In Tagore, we come across an interesting compromise between the monism of the Upanishads and the theism of the Bhagavad Gita. According to Sankhya, Purusha is void of form, content, or attribute. It is pure life monad, luminous, eternal, omniscient, all pervading, and changeless. In its original form, it is perfectly isolated and detached, but when engulfed in the lifeless matter of Prakriti, nature, its omniscience is reduced to limited consciousness and it becomes involved in the life process and in bondage. Purusha, though actionless, passive, uncreative, and not an efficient cause of anything, apparently seems to act, produce, and go through life processes when masked by the matter of Prakriti. As a matter of fact, Purusha is only a catalytic presence in the material body, its role being that of mere activator of Prakriti, but the actual activity, creativity, agitation, growth, decay, etc. belong to Prakriti, enveloping it. The eternal craving of Prakriti for Purusha, the former being completed and consequently liberated by the latter, a fascinating reading of Sankhya philosophy and the Chinese theory of yin and yang, is to be found in Tagore's Chandalika. Originally adapted from a Nepali Buddhist lore, Shardula Karna Avadana. The story is set in Shravasti where Lord Buddha is resting for a while. Ananda, a handsome monk and a much loved disciple of Buddha, on his way to meet the Lord, feels thirsty and asks for water from Prakriti, a Chandali, an untouchable, drawing water from a well. Prakriti is instantly infatuated with the monk and, in a state of sheer desperation, urges her mother Maya to use her magical skills to bring Ananda back. The mother, failing to pacify her daughter, hesitantly performs elaborate magic rites, throwing 108 flowers in the sacrificial fire. Ananda, anguished by severe compunction, retraces his steps back to Prakriti, dragged by the irresistible magical force unleashed by the rites performed. Prakriti, unable to witness the distress of Ananda, praying fervently to Lord Buddha for redemption, asks her mother to remove her spell. The play ends with Prakriti celebrating her redemption and Ananda blessing her. Lord, you have come to redeem me. Such a price you have paid. So much sorrow you have borne. Do forgive, do forgive. I have pulled you to earth, brought you down from dust. Do raise me to your pure radiance. Do forgive. Victory be yours, victory be yours. Let victory be, victory be. Do forgive. Ananda says, blessing to you, the blessed maiden. There is no confrontation, subjugation, or pain at the end. Love, forgiveness, reconciliation, redemption, and enlightenment are found instead. Water, a purifying and cleansing agent with feminine maternal power of fertilizing, proves its inefficacy in washing the blood from Macbeth, who asks himself if all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood. Will all great Neptune's ocean wash this blood clean from my hand? He answers his own query. No, this my hand will rather the multitudinous seas incarnadine, making the green one red. Lady Macbeth is indeed proved wrong, for a little water does not clear them of their deed. Interestingly, water is associated with thunder, lightning, rain, and the witches who stand for notions of perverted femininity. The first witch enumerates the weather conditions that can prove hospitable to witchcraft. When shall we three meet again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain? This rain is not divine grace that descends unasked on earth. It's a hostile rain that is accompanied by fog and filthy air through which hover creatures of darkness. As the three witches leave in Act 1, Scene 1, they chant, "Fair is foul and foul is fair, hover through the fog and fill the air." The image of the sea, tossed by a witchy storm, and water being drained from a sailor's body, turning him dry as hay, bring back the association of the unnatural with the natural in Act 1, Scene 3. "I will drain him dry as hay. Sleep shall neither night nor day hang upon his penthouse lid. He shall live, a man forbid." The water motive is back in Act 4, Scene 1 in the form of a vicious brew. In a cavern, the weird sisters throw awful ingredients such as eye of newt, toe of frog into a cauldron full of boiling brew. Hecate arrives and all dance and sing. We do feel that nature is deflected from its proper function. It is a dreadful transformation of nature that leads to a kind of a nexus between nature and the perpetrators of mischief. You murdering ministers, wherever in your sightless substances, you wait on nature's mischief. And then to himself, Macbeth addresses the visionary dagger which his imagination has called up. And then as midnight approaches, he reflects that nature is now invested with the appearances of death and provides an ideal setting for the performances of rituals that relate to witchcraft. If the witches represent the malevolence that already exists in Macbeth, then the liaison enjoyed by them with nature is shared by Macbeth as well. Now over one half world, nature seems dead, and wicked dreams abuse the curtained sleep. Witchcraft celebrates pale Hecate's offerings, and withered murder, alarmed by his sentinel, the wolf, whose howls his watch, thus with his stealthy pace, with Tarquin's ravishing strides, towards his design, moves like a ghost. The witches reside in the hostile, uninhabitable heath. Both the witches and the heath are connotative of the margin, one becoming a metaphoric extension of the other. There is a strange feeling that nature aids malevolence at times, though we do have a number of identifications between nature and grace, as in the temple haunting martlet, suggesting the royal innocence of Duncan, or in the image of heaven's cherubim horsed upon the sightless couriers of the air. Nature certainly comes up as an avenger or a confronter, whether that be the slow revenge or of nightmare or insomnia, where sleep is among the supremely valuable functions of creative nature, or the turning wild of the horses that belong to Duncan, whereby they broke their stalls, flung out, contending against obedience as they would make war with mankind. Or in water's refusal to wash away the metaphoric blood from Duncan's hands. Or be it in the final confrontation of Macbeth with the metaphoric woods of Burnham. As it stands, the soul vanquished by malevolence is also the soul defeated and subjugated by nature. and nature emerges as no less of an equivocator than the witches, as both the witches and nature aid, provoke, and arouse Macbeth's innate malevolence only to confront and avenge him. The charges against ecofeminists are that they are essentialist, ethnocentric, anti-intellectual, goddess worshippers who mistakenly portray the earth as female. However, if we go by their way of looking at the world, then defiled nature is a metaphor of perverted femininity, while on the brighter side we have nature represented allegorically through Prakriti in Chandalika. The thirst of Ananda is the eternal desire of Purusha, the center, for its driving force manifested through Prakriti, the margin. The centrifugal force is equally balanced by the centripetal attraction of Prakriti for Purusha. Ananda's drinking of water drawn from Mother Nature's innermost recesses symbolically represents the union of Prakriti and Purusha. Water becomes a bridge that links these antipodal entities, redeeming both by instilling a feeling of fulfillment. The words which none could utter, he put forth so easily. Give water, give water, give water. What a tiny message, with how much immense glow. It lit up my whole birth. What is really worth noting is that the notion is in no way an engulfing of one by the other. Prakriti's frantic effort to overpower Ananda ends in remorse and an enlightening realization that the fleeting moment of coming together will be followed by a separation, viraha, that will eternally keep the flame of desire burning in the heart of the devotee for the deity with painful pleasure. The theory of dualism propagated by Vaishnavism to be found in the perpetual craving of Radhika for Krishna. This also makes way not for confrontation but rather a cohabitation of Prakriti and Purusha. Nature does frown, like a moral guardian, upon Maya's unnatural endeavor to drag Ananda back to Prakriti through lightning flashes, darkness, foaming seas and storms, a metaphoric representation of the dilemma that rages within the soul of Prakriti. But it never instills terror in human hearts. In fact, colorful and happy images of nature in the form of sunshine, blooming flowers, ripe corns, joyous blue skies, and not to forget water, just as a handful of which has the power to wash away blemishes of multiple births, are to be found in abundance. Maya, the mother, performs the rites out of sheer helplessness, gnawed from within by pangs of guilt and remorse, reprimanding the adamant daughter for her restive flame of desire. O stone-hearted one, how cruel is your mind! What a stern soul! Still you remain alive. Prakriti outgrows her restive desire to crave not for the body but for the pure radiance entrapped within its consciousness. O mother, O mother, O mother, do remove your spell right now, right now, right now. O demon, what have you done? Why didn't you die, the vicious one? Where's my glowing radiance bright, pure, immaculate sight? The discussion may conclude with Tagore's version of cohabitation and juxtaposition of antipodals in this creation. I quote, "In truth, acceptance and rejection are equally true. One lives in the other, neither is complete by itself. Our fulsome experiences may be derived only upon joining the two. Lord Shiva is the symbol of renunciation and Annapurna his consort of worldly indulgence. It is only when these two unite that there comes the joy of fullness. In our lives, whenever the two are separated, whenever there be a conflict between desire and the conquest of desire, there comes turmoil and unhappiness. It was the wish of our ancient text writers that in Hindu society, the contrary forces of Shiva and his consort be united. They found that in the entire cosmos, truth and beauty came through reconciling pairs of opposites, acceptance and rejection, attraction and repulsion, centrifugal power and the centripetal, the woman and the man." Thank you. Hope to meet you all next week with a new discussion.